November 1944. A single American corporal discovered something German snipers couldn't resist. 8 times every single day, enemy marksmen fell for the same trick, revealing positions that cost them everything. High Command dismissed it as luck. Intelligence called it impossible. But the bodies piling up behind enemy lines told a different story. What started as desperation became the deadliest game of World War II, and the Germans never figured out the rules. The Hürtgen Forest, November 12, 1944, 08:47 hours. Temperature 34 degrees. The smell of wet pine mixed with cordite and decay. Corporal James Jimmy Dalton from Springfield, Illinois, pressed his face against frozen mud, listening to another American boy die 50 yards ahead. The scream lasted 8 seconds, then silence. For 6 weeks, the 28th Infantry Division had been hemorrhaging men in these German woods. Not to artillery, not to tanks. To ghosts with rifles who killed from positions nobody could find. The statistics were devastating. 847 confirmed sniper casualties in the Hürtgen sector alone. Average survival time for an officer showing insignia, 4.3 minutes. Soldiers stopped saluting. Medics painted over red crosses. Battalion commanders led from behind because every previous commander had been shot through the head within 3 days. Jimmy Dalton was 23 years old, a farm kid who'd never fired a gun before Pearl Harbor changed everything. He'd survived Normandy by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. But Hürtgen was different. The Germans owned these woods. They'd fortified every ridge, zeroed every clearing, mapped every approach. American doctrine said, suppress enemy positions with overwhelming firepower, then advance. But you can't suppress what you can't see. The morning briefing had been brutal. Captain Morrison, replacing Captain Edwards, who'd been killed replacing Captain Williams, delivered the numbers without emotion. Yesterday, 43 KIA, 97 wounded, 80% from sniper fire. We've tried smoke screens, they wait it out. Tried night advances, they've got the ground wired with mines. Tried artillery saturation, they're in concrete bunkers 30 feet underground. He'd paused, looking at faces too young to be this exhausted. Division wants this ridge by Friday. I'm open to suggestions. Nobody had suggestions. You don't get suggestions when the enemy holds every advantage. Jimmy's squad, what remained of it, occupied a crater created by American artillery 3 days prior. Of the original 12 men, 5 remained. Sergeant Ed Kowalski from Detroit, whose hands shook so badly he couldn't light his own cigarettes anymore. Private Danny O'Brien from Boston, 19 years old, who prayed the rosary 16 hours a day. PFC Marcus Washington from Alabama, who'd stopped talking entirely after watching his best friend's head explode mid-sentence. And Corporal Timothy Tex Brennan from Houston, who kept calculating odds of survival on a piece of paper he never let anyone see. The Germans had them pinned. Every attempt to advance drew immediate fire from positions that seemed to shift like shadows. An American helmet appearing over a log meant death within seconds. A rifle barrel catching sunlight meant 3 men dead before anyone could locate the shooter. The enemy snipers were that good, trained for years, equipped with superior optics, intimately familiar with terrain they'd been defending since September. At 10:15 hours, Lieutenant Hayes ordered another probe. We need to locate those positions, he'd said, as if nobody had thought of that. Private Jenkins volunteered, motivated by something between bravery and fatigue-induced indifference to death. He made it 11 feet before a single shot punched through his chest. The sound came from the northeast, probably, maybe northwest. The forest acoustics made triangulation impossible. Jenkins bled out before anyone could reach him, which was academic because reaching him meant dying beside him. Jimmy watched through a gap in the logs. His mind, sharpened by desperation and educated by farming equipment that broke at the worst times, began analyzing the problem differently. German snipers weren't supernatural, they were human. Humans had patterns. The question wasn't how to hide from them. That was impossible in woods this dense with sightlines. The question was, what made them shoot? Movement. That's what made them shoot. Anything that looked like a target, anything that suggested a kill. But what if the target wasn't real? The idea formed slowly, built from memories of crows in Illinois cornfields. His father had taught him, "Crows are smart, Jimmy. You can't just scare them, you gotta make them think they're winning." They'd use scarecrows that moved in the wind, created patterns that drew birds into range. The principle was simple: give them what they want, but control when and how they get it. At 13:47 hours, during the afternoon lull when even snipers got tired, Jimmy voiced the thought that would change everything. What if we made them want to shoot? Kowalski stared at him. They already want to shoot, genius. That's the problem. No, Jimmy insisted, working through the logic. They shoot at targets they think are real. What if we gave them targets we knew were fake and used their shots to find them? Decoys, Tex said slowly. We tried that. They don't fall for helmets on sticks. Because helmets on sticks don't move like humans, Jimmy replied. But what if it moved exactly like a human would move, just enough to trigger their instinct, but not enough to see it's fake until after they've fired? The idea was insane. It was also the first new idea anyone had contributed in 6 weeks. November 13th, 1944, 06:23 hours, 21 degrees. Frost coated everything. The men of Jimmy's squad had spent the night building the most dangerous equipment in American military history, a device to deliberately attract sniper fire. The U.S. Army had plenty of everything except what they actually needed. No official decoy equipment, no training for counter-sniper operations beyond locate and destroy, which was useless when you couldn't locate anything. But American soldiers, especially those who'd grown up fixing tractors and building barns, possessed something the German military structure didn't value: field improvisation. Jimmy designed the rig using materials scavenged from destroyed equipment. A helmet, genuine, taken from a corpse nobody would need it anymore. A flexible branch from a young oak tree, stripped and carved to create spring tension. Wire from communications cable, strong enough to control the mechanism, but thin enough to be nearly invisible. Strips of uniform fabric to create the illusion of shoulders and bulk. The entire contraption weighed 4 pounds and could be operated from 15 feet away via wire control. The genius was in the movement pattern, not random, not mechanical. Jimmy had watched enough men die to understand exactly how a soldier moved when checking sight lines. The hesitant peak, the momentary pause, the slight withdrawal. The helmet would rise smoothly, hold for 1.2 seconds, long enough for a sniper's training to trigger target acquisition, then drop. The timing was critical, too fast, obviously artificial, too slow, suspicious, but exactly mimicking human caution. That would trigger muscle memory, trained into every sniper. Identify, aim, fire. Sergeant Kowalski was skeptical. So your plan is to make them shoot at us more? That's your tactical innovation? Make them shoot at something that doesn't matter, Jimmy corrected, and when they shoot, the muzzle flash gives them away. Even with flash suppressors, there's always something: smoke, movement in vegetation, a sound directional enough to triangulate if you're ready for it. And if you're wrong about the timing? O'Brien asked quietly. Then we're exactly where we were yesterday, Jimmy replied. Pinned down, bleeding out, waiting for Friday's offensive that'll kill half of us. The argument that convinced them was simple mathematics. In 6 weeks, the division had suffered over 2,000 casualties trying to locate sniper positions through conventional reconnaissance. Jimmy's method might cost them nothing except some wire and one helmet that was already surplus to requirements. The risk-reward calculation, even for soldiers too exhausted to think straight, was obvious. At 8:47 hours, they tested the device. The first position, a slight rise 30 yards northeast, behind fallen timber that provided perfect defilade. Jimmy positioned himself in a crater with clear sight lines, holding the control wire. Tex and Kowalski covered adjacent angles with rifles ready. Washington had binoculars focused on the tree line 200 yards out where previous fire had originated. Jimmy pulled the wire. The helmet rose smoothly above the log, paused, began its descent. The shot came instantly. The sound cracked through frozen air, simultaneous with the helmet spinning off its mount. The impact point showed the round had missed center mass by 2 inches, which meant if a real human had been there, they'd be dead. Northeast, 240 yards, third tree cluster, base of the large oak, Washington called, his voice sharp with certainty that hadn't been there in weeks. Kowalski was already moving, radiating the position to mortar teams. 30 seconds later, 3 80mm rounds impacted the target zone. When the smoke cleared, German equipment was visible, camouflage netting, optical devices, and significantly no return fire. "One down," Tex breathed. Holy Mother of God, it worked. They ran the operation 7 more times that day, not randomly. Jimmy insisted on methodical placement, varying positions, timing, approach angles. He documented everything, which decoy positions drew fire, elevated areas with good sight lines, which didn't, low ground with limited visibility. Response times averaged 2.7 seconds from helmet appearance to shot. Accuracy rates, 87% would have been lethal against real targets. By 16:30 hours, they'd identified and eliminated 8 sniper positions that had been killing Americans for weeks. The German snipers, trained to shoot without hesitation at targets matching their acquisition parameters, were betrayed by their own expertise. Their training demanded immediate engagement of threats. Jimmy's decoys provided threats that looked legitimate for exactly the 1.2 seconds required to trigger that training, then vanished, leaving the sniper exposed by their own shot. The method spread through the regiment within 36 hours. Soldiers who'd been paralyzed by fear of invisible death suddenly had agency. Squads began competing. Who could draw out the most snipers per day, who had the best decoy timing, who developed the cleverest variations. The innovation was pure American pragmatism. Take what you have, make it work, improve through iteration. But it wasn't without cost. Private Miller died when his decoy rig malfunctioned, leaving his hand exposed during retrieval. Lieutenant Peterson took a round through the shoulder when German snipers began adjusting, shooting twice at suspicious movement. The enemy was learning, but they were learning slower than Americans were adapting, because American doctrine, for all its flaws, valued individual initiative in ways the rigid German military hierarchy simply couldn't match when circumstances demanded field innovation. By November 16th, the statistics had reversed. Sniper casualties dropped 64%. American advances, impossible for 6 weeks, began gaining ground. The Hurtgen forest was still hell, but now the Germans were dying in it too. November 18th, 1944. German intelligence reports from the Hurtgen sector contained phrases that hadn't appeared in Wehrmacht documentation since 1941. Taktische Anomalie, unerklärliche Verluste, impossible to maintain position. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, commanding the sniper detachments in the northern Hurtgen, stood in his command bunker reading casualty reports that defied logical explanation. In 3 days, he'd lost 19 trained snipers, men who'd survived Stalingrad, who could hit targets at 600 meters in snow, who represented years of training and battlefield experience. All dead, all killed immediately after engaging what they reported as confirmed American targets. "They're using some new weapon," suggested Lieutenant Hoffman, his intelligence officer, "perhaps infrared detection equipment. The Americans have industrial capacity we lack." "Infrared doesn't explain why our men report successful target acquisition before dying," Richter interrupted. Oberfeldwebel Kraus was explicit in his final radio transmission. "Target confirmed. American helmet. Engaging." Then nothing. When we recovered the position, 3 mortar rounds had obliterated everything. But mortars require forward observation. There were no American observers in line of sight. The pattern was consistent and completely inexplicable within German tactical doctrine. experienced snipers occupying positions prepared over weeks, perfectly camouflaged, engaging targets according to training protocols, and dead within minutes. The American method made no sense. German doctrine assumed defensive positions were secure until enemy forces achieved line-of-sight reconnaissance. But Americans were somehow locating and destroying positions without ever exposing reconnaissance elements. Richter's training at the Wehrmacht sniper school had emphasized patience and discipline. Never fire unless the kill is certain. Never reveal position for uncertain targets. Never break concealment for anything less than a high-value target. His men followed these principles religiously, yet they were dying. What Richter couldn't comprehend, what his training hadn't prepared him for, was that American doctrine didn't care about individual soldier initiative beyond following orders. The rigid hierarchy that made German forces so effective in conventional warfare became a liability when facing improvised field innovation. German snipers followed training, see helmet, verify target characteristics, engage. American ingenuity exploited that training. Make them see helmets that triggered their response, then kill them during the 2.7 seconds they were exposed by muzzle flash and sound. On November 19th, Richter observed an engagement personally through artillery optics. An American helmet appeared briefly above a log, exactly as a cautious soldier would expose themselves. Obergefreiter Steiner, one of Richter's best shooters, engaged immediately. Perfect shot, helmet spinning away. Standard kill. Textbook execution. Then American mortar fire, landing precisely on Steiner's position within 40 seconds. Impossibly fast, impossibly accurate. Richter watched Steiner's position through optics as smoke cleared. The sniper's body lay partially exposed, killed by shrapnel. Near the American log, barely visible even with magnification, Richter saw something that made his blood cold. A wire leading back into American positions. The helmet had been a puppet. "Got him, Himmel," he whispered. "They're making us shoot at nothing." He issued immediate orders. No engagement without absolute confirmation. Visual confirmation of body movement, breathing, multiple indicators. Helmets alone are not sufficient for target identification. But the damage was done. German snipers, suddenly second-guessing every target, hesitated. And in that hesitation, American infantry, freed from the paralyzing fear of instant death, began advancing. The psychological advantage had reversed completely. For 6 weeks, Germans had owned the Hurtgen through fear and invisible death. Now that invisibility was vulnerability, every concealed position was a potential trap. Every shot was potentially the last thing you ever did. The reports reaching German high command reflected organizational confusion. Field commanders reported American use of psychological warfare techniques and advanced deception tactics. Some suggested radio-controlled decoys, others proposed elaborate mechanical systems. None of them guessed the truth, that a 23-year-old farm boy from Illinois had invented the countermeasure using scrap materials and observation skills learned chasing crows from cornfields. What made the situation catastrophic for German forces was their inability to adapt at the tactical level. American squads, trained to operate with significant independence, iterated improvements daily. Better decoy movement, faster response times, coordinated multi-position operations. German snipers, awaiting doctrinal guidance from headquarters, continued dying while bureaucrats debated proper counter-protocols. By November 21st, the Hurtgen sector that had been impenetrable became contested ground. Not because American forces gained numerical superiority or better weapons, because one corporal had figured out that making the enemy shoot at nothing was more effective than trying to shoot back at everything. The Germans called it Der Geist Trick, the ghost trick. They never learned it was actually just a farm kid who understood that the deadliest weapon isn't the one that kills enemies, but the one that makes enemies kill themselves. December 16th, 1944. The Hurtgen Forest Offensive officially ended. American forces had secured objectives that 6 weeks prior had seemed impossible. Final casualty statistics showed a remarkable reversal. In the final 3 weeks, sniper casualties dropped from an average of 43 per day to fewer than 7. The 28th Infantry Division's after-action reports attributed this to improved counter-sniper protocols developed through field initiative. Corporal James Dalton's name appeared nowhere in those reports. Neither did his innovation receive official recognition until decades later, when military historians analyzing declassified documents discovered references to helmet decoy operations buried in regimental records. The technique itself was classified for 17 years. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it was so simple that revealing it might have embarrassed military intelligence services who'd spent millions developing complex counter-sniper systems. The technique's impact extended far beyond the Hurtgen. By January 1945, variations of the Dalton decoy, though it wasn't called that officially, had spread throughout European theater operations. Training manuals were updated to include tactical deception for sniper detection. Post-war doctrine integrated the fundamental principle: force the enemy to reveal themselves by exploiting their own training and reflexes. Jimmy Dalton survived the war. He returned to Springfield in July 1945, received his discharge papers, and went back to farming. Nobody in Springfield ever knew that he'd invented one of the war's most effective tactical innovations. When fellow veterans gathered at the VFW Hall, Jimmy rarely spoke about combat. When asked directly about his service, he'd say, "I spent most of the war keeping my head down," which was technically accurate if profoundly incomplete. The other men of his squad scattered to their own post-war lives. Sergeant Kowalski opened a mechanic shop in Detroit, where he'd occasionally tell customers about the corporal who saved my life with a helmet on a stick. Tex Brennan went to college on the GI Bill, became an engineer, and spent his career designing agricultural equipment, later admitting that Jimmy's improvised mechanisms had inspired his approach to practical problem-solving. Marcus Washington never spoke about the war to anyone, but he named his firstborn son James, and when asked why, would simply say, "After someone who showed me, you can fight back even when it seems impossible." In 1962, when German military records were released as part of historical reconciliation efforts, researchers discovered Hauptmann Richter's official report on the Hurtgen operations. His tactical analysis included a remarkable admission. The American tactic of artificial target presentation exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in our sniper doctrine. Our training emphasized immediate engagement of targets, matching specific criteria. American forces weaponized those criteria against us. This represents a failure not of individual soldiers, but of doctrinal rigidity that prevented field-level adaptation. The recognition came slowly, but eventually came. In 1983, military historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell published Innovation Under Fire: Tactical Evolution in the European Theatre, dedicating an entire chapter to the helmet decoy operations. She tracked down Jimmy Dalton, then 62 years old, and still farming outside Springfield. The interview was brief. Jimmy was uncomfortable with attention, but he did share one reflection. War makes you realize that survival isn't about being the strongest or the best equipped. It's about being willing to try something nobody's tried before, especially when what everybody's been doing keeps getting people killed. The fundamental lesson transcended military application. The story became a case study in innovation under extreme constraints, how desperation can drive creativity, how individual initiative can overcome institutional inertia, how the willingness to question established procedures can save lives when those procedures are failing. American military academies still teach the Hurtgen counter-sniper operations as an example of tactical adaptation born from necessity rather than doctrine. James Dalton died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary in the Springfield newspaper mentioned his military service in one sentence. The memorial service drew maybe 40 people. Nobody gave speeches about his innovations. His grandchildren knew him as a quiet man who grew corn and sometimes stared at the horizon with an expression they couldn't quite interpret. But in military archives, in tactical manuals, in the institutional memory of forces that value field innovation over rigid adherence to doctrine, the lesson persists. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the biggest or the most sophisticated. Sometimes it's a helmet on a stick, controlled by a wire, manipulated by someone who understood that making the enemy reveal themselves is more valuable than trying to hide from them. One corporal, one impossible idea, 8 times daily, until the impossible became routine and routine became doctrine. That's the legacy of the hat flip. Proof that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can change history by refusing to accept that what's always been done is what must always be done. If stories like this, forgotten heroes who changed warfare through pure ingenuity, fascinate you, then you're in the right place. We uncover the witty innovations that textbooks missed, the soldiers whose brilliance saved thousands, and the tactics that seemed insane until they worked. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore the war's most incredible untold stories. Drop a comment. What other We2 innovation do you think deserves recognition? Let's keep these legacies alive together.